John, just as a historical question, going back to late 2001, just to get a sense of how much we went on a wartime footing. Jim Sensenbrenner, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, said that, told me at that time, that you guys had sent up a bill that he said was a total non-starter that would suspend habeas corpus broadly for the first time since the Civil War. So I just want to know what your thinking was in even floating that on Capitol Hill in the period right after.
I actually wasn't involved in that. That's the first I'd heard of it, actually. I didn't
Jane Harmon.
Yeah, I didn't know we'd done
I don't know
that.
if she's here in the room now, but she knows about this as well.
I mean, I'm not trying to deny that we did it, because it just might be a division of authority within the Justice Department, that there's a separate office that's in charge of legislative proposals, and my office wasn't in charge of that. So it very well could have been that the department did that. Personally, I would not have been in favor of it. I think he also approached this question. We had a big debate about whether to declare war on September 12th, and and sort of suspending habeas would have been a natural follow-on to something like that. And it was at least my view that declaring war would not be a good idea, in part because you would trigger an enormous expansion of the powers of the federal government. There are all these powers which are on the books, which only get triggered when a declaration of war issues, and things like habeas are actually written into the Constitution. It seemed to me that wasn't something that the policymakers were asking for or wanted to do. And the second thing, it was inconsistent with what the president and our national leaders thought was best for us to do after September 11th, which was to go shopping, right? So, there was this weird balance that the executive and the legislative branch were trying to reach, which is to expand the powers of the government in what they thought was a wartime situation, but to not to go to the total mobilizations of World War I and World War II, or even the Korean War, where there was more significant price controls and management of the economy.
Did you think at the time what the consequences of not going on a formal war footing would be if you were, say, suspending the Fourth Amendment by rankly violating FISA, and clear violation of the Fourth Amendment and going around FISA? Did you think what the consequences of that would be if there was no endpoint, if it was in perpetuity, so that we would then have a permanent change in our civil liberties rather than a simple wartime change in those liberties?
Yeah, let me say one thing is I don't agree that violating FISA is the same thing as violating the Fourth Amendment. I think they're very different issues. And one's a separation of powers issue. The other one is, even if Congress agreed with it, the executive branch wanted to do, which is going to happen in 2 weeks, you still have a Fourth Amendment issue about whether it violates civil liberties. But I would say this, I think that, yes, if you take the step of deciding not to declare war, you are deciding that you do not want to access the full powers of the government in wartime, which have been exercised at different periods in our history, and sometimes, I'm the first to admit, have been overreactions by our government to war. And it didn't seem to me that was necessary. Certainly Congress could have done it if it wanted to, but we advised Congress that it wouldn't be a good idea to declare war. Another thing I'll say is sort of consistent with the post-World War II practice. We, for some reason, after 1945, we had the kind of national security state. We had a permanent mobilization in a way we'd never had before. We had a huge standing military, which actually was another great check that Congress had, because in previous wars, you had to build the military to have a war. Now we have the military already that Congress just constantly keeps in existence. I think that, the problem is I don't think that it was wise for us to take society to those kinds of experiences in the past where we had total mobilization. So yeah, I'd say, but that meant that some of the powers of the government would be much weaker, particularly domestic. And those are the ones where I admit the government has had the most difficulty with the Supreme Court and Congress. So I think I agree with you.
There's another dimension to this as well. I don't know to what extent it was discussed inside the administration at the time. But the nature of modern warfare and the composition of the armed forces that we had in being did not require a full mobilization on the World War II scale. We have a relatively small all-volunteer force that can be deployed without really wrenching or distorting the civilian society or the civil economy to any significant degree. In my view, that situation creates a moral hazard for the too easy and too quick resort to military force as an instrument of diplomacy. But the fact is, you don't need the full panoply of war powers as embedded in the Constitution in order to undertake significant military actions today.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. I mean, David's quite right. One way you could think about it is, before 1945, our system had a bias towards inaction, right? I mean, if you wanted to go to war, the president would have to go to Congress and not just get a declaration, but say, please build me a military, right? And that's sort of what happened in all the examples David talked about. After 1945, the president and Congress together create a system where we have a standing peacetime military, which we've never had in our history, and it's not defensive in nature. I mean, if you look at the structure of our armed forces, it's designed for power projection. And unfortunately, as we learned on September 11th, the ability of our armed forces to actually defend the territory of the United States was quite slim then. It's really a force, it's an expeditionary force almost only. And it goes back to the point about Congress and whether it wants to take accountability for its thing. By doing this, Congress gives the president the means to use force abroad at his decision. They're not going to stop him, but they also don't have to take responsibility if the war goes badly either.